Hi folks, I'm Joel. Today we're going to be talking about two different techniques that we can use if you have extreme speed requirements for your website, or if you have really interesting or different compliance requirements where you don't want to be making API requests outside of wherever your web server is located. And a couple different reasons you might need to do either of those things. You might have a server that's in a really slow environment where your network requests are not very reliable to kind of pull data from an API. And you might have a situation where you're not allowed to do that because of whatever requirements that your compliance officers or different things that your organization has required of you. So how can we satisfy those two requirements? What's a couple techniques we can use? Let's jump into how we can solve those right now. But first we want to look at what does a normal sort of situation look like? We're going to be rendering stuff. So let's look at normal rendering. So we're going to look at, first things first, we're going to render a page. It's going to make a request to a web server. It's going to pull content from our API, usually something like a Headless CMS, something like that. And full disclosure, I'm coming from Agility CMS, a Headless CMS. So we're going to use that as our example for today. But normally that's how that rendering works. And that works for most situations. And if you don't have any problems with that, I highly suggest you kind of stay with that. It works with pretty much every framework that you have, and it solves a lot of the problems that you might have with other sort of techniques. So this is the tried and true way to do it. But if you have these other two requirements, what can you do? Well, these are the things where if you have a speed that's beyond sort of 50 to 100 milliseconds and your speed requirements are outside of that, so if you're seeing a sort of network latency or a lag when you're rendering, the lag that's coming from the API could be the problem. If that's exceeding sort of 100 milliseconds, then that's a problem. So you might want to be looking at that in that case. And that's the case where your web server just sort of has slow internet. But also it could be because of your location where, depending on how your network is set up and how you're connecting to CDNs, it could be that you're not near a CDN provider, which is super rare, but it could be that you're not allowed to go outside of your location as well. So normal rendering, this is how it normally works. Okay, so the situation where we want to do something different from that. What are the techniques that we can do? The first technique we're going to talk about today is something called content sync. We're going to synchronize content over to our down to our web servers, and we're going to put it right there so we can use it. Let's see how that can work. So we've got dev, UAT, and production web servers, which is a pretty standard setup. And what we're going to do is set up the content sync so that our API is actually going to pull down to each one of these servers the content that it needs from that API. So this is something that Agility has baked in. Some other headless providers may or may not have something similar, but I'm going to be specific about how Agility actually does this. So the ways that we can actually get content down there is there's a couple of different events that we can use. On something like a dev server, we may want to do a pull of that sync every single time on every single request, because maybe maybe it doesn't have the same kind of file system, or it's a different kind of setup from our normal DevOps. So in that case, you may want to do a pull every single time a page is requested, because you're usually in preview mode at that point or working on a local development environment. But for UAT and production, we can actually essentially push that content down to those web servers using a webhook. And on the first push, it's going to pull all the content down. But on subsequent pushes, it will do what's called a delta. So it's only going to push down the content or pages that have changed, so that UAT and production servers are always going to have that updated. And that could be true even if they're doing a full build. The idea is you might want to move your content around with your code after the build as part of that build artifact. And then as that build is alive on a UAT or production server, it can then get the deltas of that. So there's a couple different setups that you can use for your web server and for your DevOps. If you don't want to put the files on the local file system, you could actually sync to a mounted file system that is hooked up to something like Azure Blob Storage or Amazon S3, which is another technique that you can use if you have multiple instances there in a sort of a load balanced environment that you want to work with. If you're just pushing to a centralized file share, then you can kind of get around that as well. So there's a lot of different techniques that you can do there. So hit me up in the comments if you have comments on this. But let's look at the impact of it. Okay, so right now we don't have to make any API requests on our web server when we're servicing a page request. That's really great. It's going to have, it's going to make sure that it's really fast and we're not doing any network requests at all from the web server to another API. From a speed point of view, we can go as low as around 5 milliseconds. It could be even a little faster if your hard drives on your web servers are solid state. It may be as slow as maybe 20 milliseconds if we're serving that from storage that's on a mounted disk. That's a network file store, something like blob storage or S3. So, but that's a lot faster order of magnitude than we had when we're making an API request out of the network, outside of our internal network on every single request. And the location of our data is either on the server itself or in our local environment. So it's a totally different way that works. All right, so that's the first technique that we had. And it works really, really well. But what if we wanted to do something totally different? What if we wanted to use something called static site generation? And this means that we don't need to use a sync API, although we could, but we can use a particular website framework, and actually we can render our whole site down to .html files. So we don't even need a web server to serve them. We just need a file server to actually output those. We don't have to do any rendering. It's super secure, super fast. Let's dig into how we can actually take care of that depending on how you want to start building. All right. So there's a few different frameworks that support this. My favorite is Next.js. Astro is quickly becoming one of my favorites. It does, both of those do that. Gatsby is kind of the old standard. It's been around for quite a while, and it does this as well. There are some other frameworks that do static site generation or static export of your site as well. These are the three that I'm personally most familiar with. Let's see how this actually works. So you've got your code. You're gonna write your code using one of those frameworks. During the build process, so you're either going to run a build manually, or usually this is going to happen as maybe part of a GitHub action, or if you're deploying to, a service that has this part built in as part of it, like Netlify, Vercel. You could use something like Azure Static Web Apps. You could use Amazon Amplify. So there's a whole different slew of things that kind of make this easier to do. That build process is going to get triggered and it's going to start going. At that point, for every single page, it's actually going to make an API request out to your CMS to pull that content in, and it's going to save that output as HTML files and other files, supporting files that it needs, usually JavaScript files and a few other things. So it's going to have everything locally there that it needs on there, and then you can serve that again from whatever server you want. It could just be from a static file server. Lots of different ways to set that up as well. Now, what's interesting about this setup is that while it creates a very, very fast website, and we'll look at that in a second, how that works, it actually can be pretty slow to do the build. The build can take a while. If you have a really big website, outputting all of those files every time you do a build could take a long time. You can actually make that a lot faster if we use the sync API instead of using the network API to actually get our content from our CMS. In this case, it would be from Agility CMS. So you can add sync on top of this to make it a little faster, but it still has to go through and build every single one of those pages. Now, Gatsby had an interesting thing and I thought Gatsby did a really smart thing here where they did something called a incremental static generation, where they can figure out what changed and only rebuild that. That's slightly different from how Next.js does incremental static generation, so don't get confused by those. Gatsby was 100% static, but it also does have some server rendering. So all of these frameworks kind of make it confusing when they sort of set things up. For Next.js, it's called a static export, and I believe it's called the same thing for Astro as well, to get 100% static output from your site. What this looks like is, again, very similar to what we saw with the sync rendering. When we get a page request coming in from the internet, our web and file server has everything it needs right there to service that request. It's going to be really fast. You're probably going to see something way lower than that 20 milliseconds, or certainly much lower than 100 milliseconds to put that together. And what's interesting with static rendering is there's no server happenings at all. It doesn't have to do any looping of things. It doesn't have to go through and actually do any logic on the server. It just takes the file and delivers it right to your browser client, and it works really fast. So those are the two different techniques that we've got. If you have extreme speed requirements, if you have slow network from your server, from your web server environment, or if you have some kind of compliance requirement where you're not allowed to make network requests outside of your server every time you want to be delivering a web page to the browser. So I hope that really helped you with those, and hit me up in the comments if you have any questions or any comments about different frameworks that you're looking at or different ways that you've seen sync working in your own experience. Thanks very much.